And then the human, so the dog has no self. There's no, except a few dogs who live with very neurotic humans. The beginning, they can see the beginning of the ego develop, and it rubs off. But it doesn't happen very often, but I have seen it. So, thinking was a wonderful thing, deriving thought, but gradually over thousands of years, humans became more and more identified with conceptualization with their mind. More and more their identity was derived increasingly from the movement of thought. And now we've arrived at this point where the human ego is quite dysfunctional in many ways. It creates a lot of suffering. Humans create a lot of suffering to start with for themselves. A lot of the suffering in your life is to do with your ego. A lot of the suffering in your life is not created, and this is something to verify in your own experience, not to something to believe in when I say this now. A lot of the suffering in your life is ultimately not derived from what happens in your life. And by suffering, I mean, it starts with the slightest irritation of a little bit of anger coming, or some kind of sadness descending, or a mood comes upon you, some dark mood, you wake, you don't know why, leave me alone, don't want to do it. Suffering comes in many forms, psychological suffering, but humans carry an enormous burden of suffering. If you are unawakened, completely identified, there are millions of humans walking on this planet carrying a very heavy burden of suffering, which they call me and my life. And they're so unhappy with themselves and their life. And an outside observer would say, well, they are justified in being unhappy, because all these things, they have a bad script. But then even people with a good script are very unhappy, I have observed. I've met people who have achieved what this world considers to be ultimately desirable, fame, fortune, wealth, everything, and they're miserably unhappy. Well, that didn't work either. And so there's what is it that creates the unhappiness? Ultimately, not the circumstances of your life, but the way in which your mind speaks to you about the circumstances of your life. The narrative in your mind, the greater part of your suffering is created by the narrative in your mind.
That's right.
Now you have to verify that in your own experience, not believe what I'm saying. So next time you begin to suffer, in whatever form, it could be very soon. You may even be suffering right now. You think, I want to get out of here. How can I get out without disturbing everybody and thinking that I'm stupid because I'm walking out of here, but I want to walk out, I can't stand this anymore. Why would I even come here? This makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, where does the suffering arise? Because this man is talking on the stage, or the narrative in your mind? I can't stand it anymore, it's awful. He's talking complete nonsense. I shouldn't have agreed to come here. But I always do that, don't I? I can't say no, so I'm so stupid. Where does the suffering arise? From this little man talking on a chair, quite harmless? Or the narrative in your mind that goes, awful. And then after the event you go home and you say, he dragged me to this awful speaker, and then and then I just couldn't stand it anymore, and I even have pain in my legs, and I have a headache, because you created it all. I didn't. And so next time, if it's not here, it'll be somewhere else. Some kind of suffering arises, something not going right, and you begin to suffer, perhaps in a minor way, perhaps just a slight irritation. This shouldn't be happening. Complaining about somebody, what they did or failed to do, in your mind or out aloud, doesn't matter. And you feel, it doesn't feel good. And then perhaps at this moment you remember these words and say, oh, he said something about this experiment when I'm upset about something. Let's just put it like that. When I'm upset about something, to look at how this happens, and then to ask, and then he said, I'm going to say it now. And then he said, ask yourself, how would I experience this situation without adding any thought to it? You just let it be as it is, without adding any thought to it. How would I experience this moment? So, just now you were irritated by something, impatient, complaining, it was awful. And, okay, now let's experiment. I'm now not going to add any thought to this moment. How do I experience it now? It just is. It is as it is. Where's the suffering? Did it come from the circumstances, or did it come from the way in which your mind judged the circumstances? Right, of course, if you are find yourself in circumstances that are truly unpleasant, and then of course you know, if it's also to get out of these circumstances, whatever situation you're in, of course you take steps towards getting out. It doesn't mean if you don't create suffering, you're going to be stuck in the mud for the rest of your life. But if you're in the mud and you're walking, and how do I get out? Well, it's this way, okay. Without the narrative, why am I still in this? I'm in this awful situation. Why did I get here? What did I do? Why did he send me there? Why didn't they do? They should have done something else. Oh, no, the inner voice that creates so much suffering, and people carry that. The voice that never stops, and there are millions of humans who carry this unhappy identity around with them, not knowing, believing it's all created by others. Everything is created by outer circumstances, never looking at the way in which I react to outer circumstances, which is the beginning of freedom. Of course, many outer circumstances are unpleasant. For example, I experienced, there was a period in my life when I experienced homelessness. Now, this is usually considered as not desirable to be homeless. I mean, it's awful, especially if you live in a cold climate. That's why so many homeless people move to California, and other reasons too. But I'm homeless for a while. Now, this would have been a very unhappy period in my life, but the strange thing is, it happened soon after I had this awakening, where I disidentified from my conditioned mind, and I became aware of. So this disidentification happened in one night, and the unhappy self, which was sustained by continuous unhappy thoughts, the unhappy self, I suddenly recognized the unhappy self as something I couldn't live with anymore. So my script was really bad. So in other words, I said, I can't live with this script anymore. I mean, I didn't use those words, but I couldn't live with the script anymore, and suddenly something happened. There was a separation of consciousness that had identified with thought, suddenly removed itself from thought. And here was the unhappy me that was no longer being sustained by thought. It just began to collapse. And what remained here was just the consciousness that was now no longer identified with these unhappy thoughts that became my person, the person. So that was the setup, and this is everybody's path towards on your journey of awakening, which is, this is it, you are awakening, or already awakened, and there is this separation that thought, identified with thought, and so what was left of me was the simple sense of, it's very hard to describe. I am peace, presence, inner peace. I didn't know why. It took several years before I could explain what had happened. I didn't understand it. I just know that suddenly I was peaceful before I was unhappy. I didn't realize that the sense of this fictitious self had kind of dissolved. It took 3 or 4 years for me to realize that. So the thing can happen without you understanding it. But why do you suddenly feel at peace? Because I was living in London at the time, and then I was in the usual, I had to catch the tube, the subway every day, and usually was very unhappy there. It's just one of the many instances that made me unhappy, being trapped in the rush hour subway, the tube. Awful. Why, my Lord, how many more years have I got to spend in awful, horrible situation? I hate my life, etc., 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 etc. And then the same thing happened again after the disidentification. It was just fine. Peaceful. All the crowded streets that before I didn't like, so peaceful. Because no thought was added to it. There was just, this is what is, the isness. Later it became a teaching, but that took years. It gradually developed, so, okay, now I get it. So I didn't necessarily understand more after awakening than before. The understanding took time. It just happened. Weird. So that's disidentification from thought, and that is, for most of you, it's a more gradual process, which means you begin to realize the possibility of it. And then there's a time period, could be months or years, where you periodically are able to step out of thought and be present, even in situations that before would have caused you suffering, because you're able to align yourself with the isness of the present moment, instead of arguing with the isness of the present moment, which is through thought. Instead of arguing with what is, you become aligned with what is. Ooh, very powerful state. It does not mean you will stuck wherever you are. You will be stuck in whatever circumstances you find yourself in. No. In fact, circumstances can change more quickly when you let go of inner resistance. So aligned with the isness. So later it became a teaching. I called it, I point to the possibility of being aligned with the isness of now, whatever arises now. And I even say, welcome it, because it is. And that's a very powerful thing. if you can be, and again, another way that a pointer that I use sometimes, you might have heard it before, make the present moment your friend, not your enemy. Even that, but you can only do that by letting go of imposing thought on the present moment that creates conflict with the present moment. Make the present moment your friend, not your enemy, and then that in itself would be a spiritual teaching. If you live it, begin to live it, would transform your state of consciousness. There was a teacher I believe in the Zen tradition, who recommended when the disciple asked him, can you give me the essence of your teachings, please, because I want to leave the monastery and go on a pilgrimage for 2 years. Please tell me, give me some spiritual practice, please, because I want to become enlightened. And the teacher says, whatever circumstances you find yourself in, any situation, always say, thanks for everything, I have no complaint whatsoever. And the disciple, is that it? Yes. There must be more. No, let's just do that. Thanks for everything, I have no complaint. Wherever you are, whatever happens to you, say that. Okay. And 2 years later he came back and said, the master said, well, did you practice? And the disciple said, yeah, I did, but it didn't work. And the master looked at him and said, thanks for everything, I have no complaint whatsoever. And the story goes that at that moment the disciple became enlightened. The last moment when he said, oh. Because there's no need to explain, but I'll explain anyway. He had used the words, the disciple had used the practice as an external practice without truly meaning it.
Understand.
And when finally he returned to the master, and he said it didn't work, and then the master repeated it, and suddenly he realized the depth of meaning there, because he let go of all resistance. So that's, again, this brings us, these spiritual practices are all related, they are all really one. That leads us to a related practice that in many New Age teachings, there's a lot that is good in New Age teachings, and some of it not so good, but a lot is good. What in New Age teaching is called gratitude, the practice of gratitude is related to that. It's also a very powerful thing that can transform your state of consciousness. And how do you practice it? You're grateful for, again, the isness of this moment. This is sometimes not understood by people who practice, and they don't practice it correctly. For example, they practice gratitude by coming up with a story. For example,